The rusted hinge groaned in protest as I pushed open the creaky cabin door. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight, illuminating a single, crimson stain on the weathered floorboards. A footprint. Not mine, not Sarah's, not anyone else's from our weekend getaway crew. Fear, cold and metallic, flooded my stomach. This wasn't supposed to be creepy. Camp Horizon was supposed to be a nostalgic revival, a chance for our fractured college friend group to mend fences 10 years after graduation. The World Trade Center attacks had scattered us then, a shared trauma that morphed into individual anxieties and diverging paths. Now, surrounded by the decaying remnants of our teenage haven, the unease hung thicker than the dust. Sarah, her usually vibrant blonde hair dulled by worry, knelt beside the print. "It looks fresh," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic chirping of unseen cicadas. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. Who else could be here? This secluded corner of upstate New York was practically abandoned. The camp shut down after a series of accidents 10 years ago, accidents some of us whispered were more sinister. A shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. John, his perpetually tense jaw even tighter, emerged from the woods, his face a mask of suspicion. John, with his brooding demeanor and dark past, expelled from college for a prank that went too far, found anything interesting? He asked, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. The rest of the group materialized, timid Emily, ever-optimistic Mark, and silent, watchful David. Tensions that had simmered for years bubbled just below the surface. John and Sarah, a once promising romance soured by accusations after September 11th. Emily, harboring a secret crush on Mark. David, the enigma, withdrawn ever since the camp accidents. Over the next few hours, the footprint became an unwelcome companion. We found it again near the abandoned archery range, then by the overgrown swimming lake. Each discovery a silent accusation, turning paranoia into a tangible entity in the humid air. That night, huddled around a crackling campfire, John's backpack snagged on a protruding branch, revealing a glint of metal. A hunting knife. John swore it was for protection, but the fear in his eyes spoke louder. Sarah recoiled, memories of their turbulent past resurfacing. The night was shattered by a scream. Emily, pale and trembling, pointed towards the woods. Mark was gone. A chilling silence descended. Then, another scream. A blood-curdling, finality-laden shriek. Panic turned to desperate action. We split up, the woods becoming a labyrinth of shadows. I found Mark first. His lifeless body sprawled at the foot of a fallen tree, a single, brutal slash across his throat. The metallic tang of blood filled my nostrils. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. Sarah appeared next, her face streaked with tears. Then came the horrifying realization, John and David were missing. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, cloaked, a distorted reflection of the moonlight playing on the blade held high. But it wasn't John or David. It was the camp caretaker, a man barely a whisper on our radar, someone we barely acknowledged during our frantic search. His voice, raspy with a twisted sense of righteousness, echoed through the trees. They didn't deserve to survive. 9/11 took everything. They moved on, lived their lives. But the towers. He wasn't targeting us. He was punishing us, survivors of a national trauma, for forgetting the pain. In that horrifying moment, the footprint clicked into place, a reminder of the past, a harbinger of the terror he planned to unleash. The fight was a blur of adrenaline and despair. Sarah, fueled by grief and rage, disarmed him. The police arrived, their sirens an unwelcome melody against the backdrop of the still woods. As we stood shivering in the cold dawn light, waiting for the paramedics, a new horror dawned. John and David were never there. They were the only ones who knew the camp's dark secrets, secrets the caretaker now intended to take to his grave. Camp Horizon, a place meant for healing, had become a monument to a different kind of terror, not of violence, but of the fractured psyche clinging to a twisted version of justice. The footprint, a chilling reminder that the ghosts of 9/11 haunted us all, in ways we never could have imagined. The metallic tang lingered in the air even after the caretaker was hauled away, his maniacal screams replaced by the oppressive silence of the woods. Mark's body, a grotesque tableau of crimson against the brown leaves, became a constant reminder of the brutal reality that had shattered our reunion. The search for John and David intensified. Hope dwindled with every passing hour. The footprint, once a symbol of suspicion, transformed into a desperate beacon, a clue that could lead us to them, or a horrifying confirmation of their fate. Each foray deeper into the woods became a macabre treasure hunt. We stumbled upon twisted lengths of barbed wire strung across barely visible paths, designed to maim rather than merely hinder. A fallen log, seemingly innocuous, concealed a rusty bear trap, its teeth gleaming with a malevolent promise. Panic turned us against each other. Accusations flew, fueled by paranoia and the desperate need to find a scapegoat. John or David? Or had one of us succumbed to the madness? The answer arrived in a horrifying display. A piece of John's shirt, snagged on a jagged rock face near the lake, led us to a scene that defied comprehension. His body, suspended from a makeshift pulley system, hung like a grotesque marionette. His chest was a gaping wound, ribs splayed open in a macabre display of butchery. The message was clear: survival was a twisted game, and the stakes were rising with each passing moment. The footprint, once a solitary clue, was now a terrifying trail leading us deeper into the killer's demented world. Panic turned us against each other. Accusations flew, fueled by paranoia and the desperate need to find a scapegoat. John or David? Or had one of us succumbed to the madness? The answer arrived in a horrifying display. A piece of John's shirt, snagged on a jagged rock face near the lake, led us to a scene that defied comprehension. His body, suspended from a makeshift pulley system, hung like a grotesque marionette. His chest was a gaping wound, ribs splayed open in a macabre display of butchery. The message was clear: survival was a twisted game, and the stakes were rising with each passing moment. The footprint, once a solitary clue, was now a terrifying trail leading us deeper into the killer's demented world. We raced against time, the air thick with the smell of propane and the approaching dawn. A desperate struggle ensued, a ballet of violence fueled by adrenaline and the primal need to survive. Sarah, fueled by a mother's fury, managed to disarm the killer, the final confrontation echoing with bone-chilling screams. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky a bloody red, we emerged from the carnage, forever scarred by the brutal orchestration of our past trauma. The footprint, a symbol of terror, now marked the end of a nightmare. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would forever be a grim reminder of the weekend getaway that turned into a descent into a killer's twisted version of justice. The propane tanks hissed ominously, a counterpoint to our ragged gasps for breath. We'd found David, his body a canvas of raw flesh, meticulously carved to resemble the mangled wreckage of Flight 93. His eyes, glazed with pain, held a flicker of recognition before dimming forever. The killer, cloaked in darkness, loomed over us, a grotesque silhouette wielding a makeshift blowtorch. The firefight that followed was a symphony of chaos. Sarah, fueled by a grief so raw it scorched the air, emptied a clip into the darkness, the bullet sparking harmlessly off unseen metal. John's mangled corpse creaked on its makeshift gallows, a macabre conductor to the dance of death. Then came the screams. Emily, caught in the crossfire, erupted in a horrifying shriek as the flames licked at her arm. Mark, momentarily forgotten, stumbled back, his throat finding a taut length of barbed wire strung across the clearing. The metallic tang of blood filled the air, a sickening counterpoint to the hiss of the propane. Panic turned to a desperate scramble for survival. The fire, ignited by a stray bullet, roared to life, a hungry beast consuming the dry tinder of the woods. We scattered, lungs burning, vision obscured by acrid smoke. The killer, a predator in his element, used the smoke as a cloak. We heard the sickening squelch of flesh, followed by a gurgle of despair. It was John's shirt again, a cruel taunt leading us deeper into the inferno. We found him hanging from a tree branch, his torso a hollowed-out shell, a horrifying recreation of the missing chunk of the Pentagon. The heat intensified, the air thick with the smell of burning flesh and pine needles. We stumbled upon the hidden propane tanks, the true centerpiece of the killer's twisted spectacle. Sarah, her face streaked with soot and tears, grabbed a rock, her voice hoarse with determination. "This ends now," she screamed, launching the rock at the exposed valve of a tank. The air split with a deafening roar, a fiery explosion that sent us flying. I landed hard against a tree trunk, the world fading in and out of focus. The flames danced a macabre jig, consuming everything in their path. When I awoke, the fire was dying, embers glowing like malevolent eyes in the settling dusk. The air hung heavy with the stench of burnt flesh and despair. Sarah, her body a canvas of burns and grime, stumbled towards me, her eyes hollowed with grief and loss. We were the only ones left. The footprint, now a charred outline on the singed earth, mocked us. It wasn't just a symbol of the killer, but of the trauma that had stalked us for years, finally exploding into a horrific climax. The police arrived later, drawn by the smoke and explosions. We were mere shells of the friends who had arrived at Camp Horizon, forever haunted by the horrors we had witnessed. The killer's body was never found, consumed by the very fire he ignited, but the truth was far more chilling. It wasn't the caretaker. He was just a pawn, a useful tool in a larger, more terrifying game. The true mastermind, the architect of our nightmare, remained at large, a whisper in the wind. Someone who understood our deepest fears, who knew exactly how to exploit the scars left by September 11th. The footprint, a chilling reminder, remained etched in my mind long after the flames died down. It was a symbol not just of the killer, but of the fractured world we lived in, a world where the ghosts of the past could rise in the most unimaginable ways. We had escaped Camp Horizon, but the terror, I feared, had only just begun. The explosion echoed through the valley, a guttural roar that seemed to rip the very fabric of reality. The air, thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh, tasted metallic on my tongue. When the dust settled, the clearing resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno. The cabin, once a symbol of youthful revelry, was reduced to smoldering embers. John's gruesome tableau hung grotesquely from the charred remains of a tree, a testament to the killer's twisted artistry. Sarah, her face a mask of soot and raw grief, stumbled towards me, her eyes reflecting a chilling emptiness. Emily and Mark were gone, consumed by the flames in a horrifying display of human pyre. The propane tanks, now twisted metal sculptures, sat like mocking sentinels. Then, a sound pierced the horrifying silence, a rhythmic clicking emanating from the woods behind us. It sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through my veins. The footprint. We hadn't been alone. The killer, or perhaps there was more than one, had witnessed the entire spectacle. Panic fueled our escape. We stumbled through the undergrowth, the darkness pressing in on us like a suffocating shroud. The clicking grew louder, punctuated by the occasional snap of a twig. Sarah, her strength fading with each ragged breath, tripped and fell. I helped her up, but my own vision was blurring, the smoke and heat taking their toll. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and cloaked, the moonlight glinting off a glint of metal in their hand. It wasn't the caretaker. This was different, something more calculated, devoid of the caretaker's rage-filled madness. The chase turned into a grotesque ballet of desperation. Sarah, fueled by a mother's fury, lunged at the figure, momentarily knocking them off balance. But the attacker was quicker, their movements fluid and practiced. They struck Sarah with a sickening thwack, the sound of bone meeting metal ringing in the night. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled forward, fueled by a primal urge to survive. The clicking grew frantic, a chorus of anticipation. Suddenly, I felt a searing pain in my leg, a bear trap, its teeth digging into my flesh. I screamed, the sound raw and desperate. The figure loomed over me, the glint of metal resolving into a pair of surgical shears. The sadistic glee in their voice sent shivers down my spine. "Welcome to the final act," they rasped, their voice distorted by a gas mask. "Remember Flight 175? A little more artistic license, wouldn't you say?" Terror turned to a steely resolve. This wasn't about revenge for 9/11 anymore. This was about survival. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around a shard of broken glass from the shattered cabin window. As the shears descended, I lunged forward, plunging the glass into the attacker's leg. A guttural scream erupted as they stumbled back, momentarily distracted. It was my chance. With a burst of adrenaline, I ripped the bear trap free from my leg, the pain a distant echo. We grappled in the darkness, a desperate struggle for dominance. The clicking grew frantic, a symphony of hungry anticipation. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath us, a sinkhole hidden by the undergrowth. We tumbled down, a sickening fall into darkness. I landed hard, the breath knocked out of my lungs. As my vision cleared, I saw the attacker sprawled a few feet away, their gas mask dislodged, revealing the pale, terrified face of a young woman, maybe no older than 20. Her leg, twisted at an unnatural angle, was trapped by a fallen rock. "Help me," she whimpered, her voice choked with fear. The air in the sinkhole was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Above us, a chorus of clicking filled the space, growing steadily louder. I looked up. The cavern walls were crawling with monstrous spiders, their eyes glowing malevolent red in the darkness. The girl's screams were drowned out by the scuttling of 1,000 legs. The footprint, it wasn't just a symbol of the killer, it was a clue, a lure leading us to the true horror, a hidden ecosystem where the darkness fed on the ghosts of the past. In that moment, trapped in a subterranean tomb with a terrified killer and a swarm of venomous predators, I finally understood. The real terror wasn't the fire or the twisted murders. It was the chilling realization that the darkness had a life of its own, a twisted hunger that would never be satisfied. And we, the survivors of Camp Horizon, were simply the latest offerings in its macabre feast. Panic clawed at my throat, but a new clarity cut through the terror. This wasn't about vengeance or reliving a national tragedy. This was about survival, both hers and mine. The girl's pain flickered across her face, a vulnerability that momentarily eclipsed the mask of the killer. "We need to work together," I rasped, ignoring the searing pain in my leg. "Those things." I gestured upwards, the clicking growing louder. Her fear morphed into a desperate understanding. Using the rocks scattered on the damp floor, we managed to wedge the fallen rock, pinning her leg free. It was a gruesome task, her whimpers intermingling with the growing symphony of clicking mandibles. Once freed, I fashioned a crude splint from a broken branch, securing it with strips torn from her shirt. The process was agonizingly slow, but with each passing moment, the clicking intensified, the scuttling growing closer. Finally, we stood, a battered and unlikely alliance. There was no time for questions or apologies. We needed to get out. Remembering a faint memory of the camp layout from childhood visits, I pointed towards a barely visible crack in the cavern wall. There might be a passage. It was a tight squeeze, the damp earth scraping against raw skin. The girl, fueled by fear, pushed forward. On the other side, we emerged into a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for us to crawl single file. The air grew colder, the stench of decay stronger, the clicking pursued us, a relentless drumbeat. But the tunnel offered a sliver of hope, a path away from the immediate threat. We crawled for what felt like hours, the darkness absolute, the silence broken only by our ragged breaths and the frantic scuttling behind us. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small cavern, its ceiling high enough for us to stand. Exhaustion overwhelmed us, but there was no time to rest. The clicking, although fainter, was still present. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance. Hope, a fragile ember, ignited within me. We stumbled towards it, emerging into a vast cavern, a hidden grotto illuminated by natural sunlight filtering through a hidden opening above. There, nestled in the corner, was a small, ramshackle hut. Smoke curled from its chimney, the promise of warmth and rescue. We approached cautiously, the silence deafening after the symphony of fear. A creaky wooden door creaked open, revealing a wizened old woman, her face etched with a lifetime of stories. Her eyes, though cloudy with age, held a spark of wisdom. We collapsed on the floor of her hut, unable to speak. Over steaming mugs of herbal tea, the woman listened patiently as the girl's story unfolded, a twisted tale of grief, indoctrination, and a warped sense of justice. The woman, a hermit who had sought refuge in the caves after the camp's closure, revealed the horrifying truth. The clicking creatures were not native, but a twisted experiment gone wrong. They were the true architects of the accidents 10 years ago. The girl, raised in the camp's ruins by a twisted caretaker, had been manipulated into becoming their unwitting servant. The authorities arrived just as dawn broke, alerted by the faint smoke from the hermit's hut. The rescue wasn't easy, but fueled by a newfound strength, we led them back through the chilling tunnels. The girl, her face streaked with tears of fear and regret, was taken into custody. Camp Horizon was quarantined, the horrors it contained finally brought to light. Justice, in its messy human form, would take its course. As for me, I returned to a life forever altered. The scars, both physical and mental, would serve as a grim reminder of the weekend getaway gone wrong. But there was also a sliver of peace. In facing the darkness, however terrifying, we had found a flicker of light, the spark of human compassion and a tenacity for survival. Camp Horizon remained a monument to tragedy, but it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And sometimes, a perfect ending can bloom from the ashes of horror, a fragile hope that whispers of healing and the possibility of moving forward.